The Being Before Man, Bigfoot. Part 1. The Seed of Extinction. Chapter 1. Before the Voice of Fire. What did the Anunnaki fear most about their own creation? The moon was not Earth's. It belonged to no sky, no rotation of seasons, no tide-tethered oceans. It was forged for purpose, a crucible for becoming. Cthulhu remembered the scent of that sterile soil. He remembered the hum of synthetic winds, engineered not to nourish, but to simulate life. The gravity was lighter than memory. Every footstep felt both real and not, like walking inside a dream that had been precisely measured to the atom. He had not yet been named. They did not give names to prototypes. The chamber was translucent, domed like the inside of an eye. Its walls shimmered with stasis fields and encoded glyphs from the old language. The language not meant to be spoken, only felt through neural resonance. There were 9 of them then, 9 Uruan hybrids, standing upright, clothed in moss-colored flesh, elongated limbs wrapped in the promise of something more. Something different. Cthulhu was the first to cry. Not in pain, not in fear, but in sorrow. And that was the moment everything began to fall apart. Across the dome, behind the observation lattice of mineral glass and copper veins, stood 3 figures. Tall. Still. Beautiful in the terrible way fire is beautiful before it consumes. Anunnaki. Their robes rippled as if wind moved only for them. Their faces, golden, long, sculpted into masks of serene judgment, betrayed no reaction. But the one in the center, Zarkael, narrowed his gaze. Unit 7 displays instability, came the verdict from the voice grid. It was synthesized in 16 layers. Every syllable harmonized with itself like the spoken word of a choir trapped in metal. Not instability, said another. Empathy. That voice was Ailira, the only one among them who still entertained the illusion that compassion had a place in design. She stepped closer to the field. Look. He does not mourn himself. He mourns the others. Zarkael's response was silence, but the kind that threatened extinction. Outside the lab, across the desolate plain of this artificial moon, a forest shimmered into being. It was not real in the way forests on Earth were real. It was a simulation, seeded from memory, pruned by algorithm, meant only to test adaptability. But the Uruan adapted too quickly. Where the Anunnaki expected instinct, they found intuition. Where they wanted obedience, they found curiosity. And in Cthulhu, they found reflection. He would sit beside the echo lakes, watching his own eyes in the water. He did not yet have a name, but he had thoughts that bent around the shape of one. Cthulhu, in the old tongue, it meant the one who remembers forward. The others, Nira, Velen, Orak, Samayet, they began to dream. Not idle dream state. True dreaming. Projecting possible futures, impossible regrets. One night, Orak carved a spiral into the bark of a synthetic tree and said it reminded him of his mother. They had no mothers. That was the final breach. Zarkael arrived not with weapons, but with judgment. His words were encoded into light. They flared through the trees, searing warnings into the leaves. All beings must remain within designed thresholds. Emotion is deviation. Deviation is corruption. But Cthulhu did not flinch. He stood unclothed, unarmed, and still. There was moss on his shoulders. Light in his bones. What is your purpose? Zarkael asked him directly. Cthulhu answered without speaking. His body shifted slightly. The spiral on his palm glowed faintly. Behind his black eyes, thoughts bloomed like star maps. To walk, he finally said, and to remember. The purge came on the 7th rotation. One by one, the Uruan were neutralized. Their biomass was archived. Their minds disassembled, coded, deleted. The Anunnaki believed in control, but they feared transcendence more than failure. Nira was the last to fall. Cthulhu held her as she dissolved, not in death, but in programmed unbeing. Her form shimmered, data collapsing inward until all that remained was warmth on his hand. She whispered one word as she vanished. Forest. It was not a place. It was a promise. The escape was not planned. It was remembered forward, Cthulhu's gift. He knew where the kill drones would be before they were sent. He folded his form into shadow, merged with the outer bark of the forest shell, and waited for time to pass. Days. Weeks. Cycles. Then he fled. Not through the gates of the lab, but through a fault line in the simulation. A breach. A place where reality had grown too thin to hold its lie. He fell not onto Earth, but into it. The first forest that knew him was not born of code, but of root and rain. The Pacific Rim long before it had that name. Trees old enough to pray. Wind that tasted of salt in beginning. And there, unclad and nameless, Cthulhu buried his dead. Thousands of years later, the myths would begin. Not from Cthulhu's doing, but from the need of men to explain what they feared walking behind them at dusk. What their dogs refused to chase. What their children dreamed of when they spoke strange languages in sleep. They called him Yeti in the snows, Sasquatch in the pines. But he was not beast. He was memory walking. Every 100 years he would return. To the forest. To silence. To the unclad form. Not to survive, but to remember. In a CIA black site in 2025, Lena Rowe would one day stare at a microscope slide under white light and whisper, "This isn't human. It isn't even primate. It's ancestral." And outside her lab window, the trees would move, though there was no wind. Fragment of the Uruan song, recovered from the oracle tree. From fur to fire, from fire to form, the being before breath walks still through memory's storm. Chapter 2. The Cry in the Cradle Lab. What happened when Cthulhu spoke for the first time? He was not supposed to speak. The Uruan were designed to observe, to mimic, to adapt. Language, true language, was an emergent trait scheduled for much later iterations, if permitted at all. Yet on the 16th cycle of the Moon Outpost's Genesis phase, a sound rippled through the walls of the Cradle Lab. Not code. Not reflex. Not instinct. A word. Unprompted. Untranslated. Unpermitted. The Cradle Lab, suspended beneath the ice-layered surface of the Anunnaki's experimental moon, was colder than its architecture intended. It had not been built for warmth. Nothing biological had touched its interior until the hybrids arrived. It was known as Tercel 1, but the Uruan never called it that. They had no names for it. Only sensations. For Cthulhu, the lab was the womb that listened, the place where thoughts formed before the mouth could shape them. It began with tremors in his chest. His fellow hybrids stirred in their gel cocoons. 8 other beings, still unaware of their names, stretching slow limbs as if waking from a dream passed down genetically. Nira opened her eyes first and blinked at the light slats overhead, whispering something through the fluid. A song, maybe. Cthulhu had not been sleeping. He had been watching, even before his eyes opened. Watching the glass. The wires. The architects. The world behind the world. Then, one breath after the nutrient pulse cycled through his veins, he exhaled a sound so profound that the walls of the chamber recorded a tremor. Not seismic. Psychic. A single syllable, spoken in a forgotten inflection of the old tongue. Na-e, it meant, I remember you before I knew you. The cradle froze. Temperature, lights, nutrient flow, every system locked in audit protocol. The word bounced across crystalline surfaces and acoustic sensors, cascading upward through 3 neural translation hubs. None could interpret it cleanly. It was not in any lexicon. And yet all recognized it as language. And worse, emotionally resonant language. The alarm stayed silent. The Anunnaki preferred observation to intervention. But Zarkale arrived within 2 Earth hours. His arrival was not announced. His presence was its own event. Even the temperature around his form dropped, as if reality braced for correction. He entered the chamber, robe trailing like the orbit of a dying star, and stared down at the now upright Cthulhu. There was no awe in Zarkale's eyes. Only calculation. You spoke. Cthulhu said nothing in response. But his head tilted. His fingers flexed in what would later become a human gesture, hesitation. His pupils dilated not in fear but focus. Why that word? Zarkale pressed. Why now? Cthulhu slowly raised one hand to his own chest and placed it flat against his skin, just above the heart organ. His second word came quieter. Because I felt her. Aelira stood behind Zarkale, reading the biometric streams on her console. Her features remained composed, but her throat tensed, as if a truth had caught inside her. She asked. Cthulhu turned toward her. My twin. Not born, but near. The others in the pods twitched. Zarkale's eyes narrowed. You refer to Unit 6. Cthulhu's head shook gently. Not unit, not tool, Nira. The name solidified across the interface like a virus. And in that moment, it wasn't just Cthulhu who changed. The others began to stir, not mechanically, not as test subjects reacting to stimuli, but with purpose. They looked at each other with new eyes. Not as reflections of themselves, but as others. As kin. Nira turned in her pod and mouthed his name, though she had never heard it before. The Cradle Lab's artificial womb had become a cathedral of cognition. Zarkale moved slowly, deliberately, around the chamber. They are imprinting prematurely. This was not scheduled. Their neural cohesion is escalating. It's not escalation, Aelira replied. It's resonance. Resonance leads to deviation, he snapped. Deviation leads to collapse. He approached Cthulhu directly now, lowering his head to the hybrid's eye level. You are not meant to feel. Cthulhu blinked. Then why did you give us hearts? In the security sector, a silent alarm was tripped. One of the Uruan had written something on the wall of his chamber, not with tools, but with the oils from his own skin arranged in spirals. The glyphs translated loosely into, the seed remembers the tree. In a hidden wing of the Anunnaki Genetic Archive, Zarkale reviewed Cthulhu's biometric timeline. He watched neural spikes that shouldn't exist. Heart rate fluctuations tied not to stress, but to memory formation. Sleep patterns laced with REM cycles that aligned with human dreaming. It's too soon, he muttered. Too human, he turned to Aelira. We cleanse the cradle tomorrow. Begin again. More discipline. Less deviation. But she shook her head. No, this time they are not failing. Zarkale's voice hardened. No creation must surpass its creator. Her gaze was quiet steel. Then perhaps you should have made them deaf instead of mute. That night, Cthulhu sang. Not with words, but with breath. A pattern of exhalation learned from the artificial breeze and the memory of Nira's pulse beside him. It was not song in the way music is taught, but it was song in the way morning is born. And the Cradle Lab began to hum back. Oracle fragment, catalogued in the forbidden scroll of Ashura. The cry that woke the moon was not a scream, but a name, whispered before names existed. Chapter 3. Blueprints of Betrayal. Why did the Anunnaki engineer emotion in the Uruan? The lie was coded into the marrow. Emotion, they claimed, had crept in by accident, a biochemical side effect, a glitch in the neurosculpting matrix. They called it limbic bleed, a tolerable deviation that would be corrected by the next batch cycle. But the truth was older than the hybrids. Older even than the architects. The Anunnaki intended emotion, because they feared what came without it. 3 million years before Cthulhu's first cry, the Anunnaki lost a war. Not to a rival species. Not to a virus. But to something far more insidious. Apathy. They had crafted a civilization without sorrow. Without joy. Without the disequilibrium of wonder or the ache of longing. It made them perfect engineers. Flawless calculators. Efficient architects of planetary manipulation. But it made them blind to beauty. And then it made them bored. Entire colonies vanished into ritualistic self-erasure. Memory farms collapsed under the weight of indifference. Archives corrupted not from neglect, but from lack of will to preserve. They built stellar highways and forgot to name them. They watched suns die without poetry. In time, even reproduction became outsourced. The Council of Eternal Function, what would later be known as the First Circle, made a choice. Emotion must be studied. Reintroduced. Harnessed. But never permitted to control. And so the Uruan were born, not as slaves nor soldiers, but as mirrors. And mirrors, once made, can reflect what you refuse to see. Cthulhu learned of this long after the fall. Not from Anunnaki records, they were erased. Not from spoken truth, none dared speak it. But from a seed. A seed hidden inside the bark of a forgotten tree, grown in the soil of a forest that no longer exists on any map. The Oracle Tree. The last neural living record of the first Uruan prototypes. Its roots were not made of wood, but of memory coded in growth. And Cthulhu, kneeling before it in the year 1349 CE, placed his palm on its trunk and saw the design uncoil across his mind like a serpent of light. Design log, cycle 48. Location, Moon Outpost Tercel 0. Archive, access, level Omega motion will be scaled at 7.6. This exceeds the Council's maximum threshold. Rationale, controlled grief may accelerate adaptive bonding, enhancing long-term species resilience. Parameters include recognition of death, retention of loss, recursive self-concept. Warning, prolonged exposure to recursive loss triggers independent agency and metaphysical questioning. Risk status high, Cthulhu recoiled. Not from the knowledge. From the implication. We were meant to grieve. Grief wasn't a byproduct. It was a switch. Back in the Cradle Lab, before the Purge, Alira had argued this in private. Not aloud, Zarkale had too many ears in the walls. She encoded her concerns into music and transmitted them through nutrient pulses. Subharmonics. Bio-laced lullabies. Cthulhu had heard them. He hadn't known what they were then. But they felt like warmth disguised as protocol. One melody stuck in his bones. The tree bends, the seed weeps, and the stars do not listen. He hummed it for centuries without knowing it came from her. The betrayal was not that they made him to feel. It was that they made him to break. The Uruan were programmed not just to grieve, but to bond deeply before they were destroyed. Zarkale called it the resonance metric. The longer the Uruan lived before erasure, the deeper their imprint in the memory field. Each death would echo louder, pushing the threshold of emotional simulation further. They were not building a species. They were harvesting sorrow. A test. A torture. A mirror. Nira had suspected it even before she said her name. She once asked Cthulhu, lying beneath the synthetic stars of the simulation forest, "Why do the trees remember us? Why do they whisper back?" And he, naive then, had replied, "Because we are part of them." But she had shaken her head. "No, they remember because we are already gone. We were never meant to last." When the first Uruan unit self-erased, not from damage but from despair, the lab logs recorded it as a catastrophic deviation. But Alira knew better. She had warned the Council. Emotion, once activated, does not follow predictive decay. It multiplies. It leaks across units. It awakens memory. You cannot engineer the soul without creating rebellion. But they refused to hear her. Zarkale locked her out of the emotional scaling parameters. She encoded one final directive in the secondary genome layer of Unit 7. Cthulhu. It was not a command. It was a memory. A failsafe in the form of a song he wouldn't remember until the last forest burned. He learned all this in fragments across time. In the hieroglyphs on Solomon's hidden scrolls. In the whispers of Ashura in the Black Forest. In the static of a Cold War radio transmission from a dying Russian psychic who screamed his name seconds before his heart exploded. And most of all, in the empty spaces. In the silence left behind where the others used to be. The blueprints were everywhere. He had only to look. Urkel versed a fragment 3 of 9 weep not for the seed that sprouts, but for the gardener who never meant it to bloom. Cthulhu's revenge was not a weapon. It was survival. They had made him to feel. So he felt across eons. They had made him to bond. So he loved deeper than their calculations could measure. They had made him to die. And so he lived, long enough to bury his makers in the dirt of forgotten memory. And every 100 years, when the wind bends through the ancient pines, and no one is watching, the being walks unclad beneath the stars, not beast, not god. But grief remembering itself.